Disclaimer, this episode comes in 2 parts. This is part 1.
Hello listeners and welcome to this week's episode of The Cult Vault. I'm your speaker Casey, and today we are going to be diving back into a topic that has already been covered on the show but with a fresh perspective. Before we get started, I wanted to run through some usual business. CrimeCon, partnered with CBS Reality, is UK's leading true crime event. If you are interested in true crime, whether that is through podcasts, journalism, forensics or documentaries, you are not going to want to miss this event. It takes place in London on June 11th and 12th, and for 10% off your ticket price, visit crimecon.co.uk and use the code CULT at the checkout and come and spend time with me there. I have made some recent changes to my Patreon tiers. From as little as £1 a month, you can now access ad-free weekly content and a shout-out on the show. From £5 a month, you can access exclusive monthly deep dives on infamous cults such as the Manson family and the Anthill Kids, as well as a 15% discount on all merch and CrimeCon tickets. You can find me at patreon.com/The Cult Vault. Thank you so much to Emily for increasing your pledge this week. It's been a tough week for me, as some of you will know, and you patrons have done so much to keep me going, and I am as grateful for you and your continued support as ever. Last week I had an incredible entry to the Ally Awards. Claudia has been nominated for her help and support of cancer survivors. After being diagnosed with anal cancer in 2004, Claudia beat her diagnosis and after treatment knew she needed to help others somehow. Since then, Claudia has launched the Anal Cancer Chat on Facebook, which now supports over 300 women of all ages in their journey through anal cancer. Nicola nominated Claudia for an Ally Award after she herself battled anal cancer and had Claudia's work as a huge support. Although Nicola has never met Claudia, she describes her as a one-woman powerhouse who has helped hundreds through their journey of anal cancer. The full story will be published on my website at cultvaultpodcast.com, where you can nominate someone who has positively impacted your life when you needed it. Let these people be celebrated and recognised, but let's say a massive thank you to Claudia and all of her work. Now on to the episode. This instalment is even longer than usual, and there are some things I need to clarify before we jump in. If you are uncomfortable with conversations around the female body and anatomy, this episode may not be for you. There is a section that focuses on exploring our bodies and the lack of sex education that often comes hand in hand with high-demand religious groups. Also, I talk a lot about a third great awakening and the potential for it happening, and I must admit that I'm completely incorrect in this statement because there has already been a third great awakening between 1855 and 1930 that includes many Christian tangents explored on this show, including Jehovah's Witnesses, Pentecostalism and Nazarene movements, and even things like the Thelema religion, which I've covered in my exclusive content when talking about Aleister Crowley. There's even an argument that the Fourth Great Awakening happened following World War II, so please forgive my indiscretion here. Also, there is a trigger warning for talk of suicidal ideation and suicide completion, so please do listen with discretion. Now here is Minerva to talk us through the history and her life in the Worldwide Church of God. So hello Minerva, and thank you for joining us on the show today. We are going to be looking at something that has been briefly covered on the show before, but hopefully you'll bring us a nice fresh perspective. So would you like to start by introducing yourself to the listeners?
Oh, thank you. Hi, Casey. Yeah, thanks for having me on the show today. So today I'm going by the name of Minerva, and this is the first time that I'm speaking publicly about being in a cult for almost 20 years. I currently live on the East Coast of the United States, and I'm just here today to talk about my personal experience.
And what is the name of the group that we are going to be looking at today?
Oh, today we're going to be discussing the Worldwide Church of God. I'm a second generation cult survivor, meaning that I grew up in the Worldwide Church of God, and my parents joined as adults, so they're first generation. My parents joined the cult officially when I was a toddler around the year 1974, 1975. And after listening to the radio broadcast and ordering the cult's free literature, they took the step to go all in, become members. So, almost because I joined so young, almost all of my memories are from being in the cult. I have just like a handful of brief memories, like flashbacks that predate our involvement.
And I understand that you're staying semi-anonymous today, so I won't ask too many questions about, your parents. Like I sometimes ask a lot of those questions about how your parents became involved and did they meet in the church and all of those questions. But can you tell us whether it was just you or did you have siblings when you were growing up?
Yeah, I could do a little bit about that. And thank you. I am staying semi-anonymous today. Our whole family joined. I did have siblings. I have, both parents were married to each other, and we joined as a family. They met outside of the cult and married and kind of came to the cult together. It was a joint decision for them. And it's not always, whether it's this cult or, another. I know lots of people who, have one parent that joined, but the other one, doesn't join.
And were you able to discuss your experiences with other family members now that you've grown up? Can you bounce kind of memories off of each other and say, oh yeah, I remember that and I remember that? Or kind of are you navigating through this journey on your own?
Largely it's on my own. I don't really talk about it with my family, including siblings. But there are friends that I grew up with in the cult that, some of whom I'm friends with today. We disconnected, I guess, as friends when we were younger, either teenage years or early adult years while in the cult. And then many years later, we reconnected, and I've got actually some really good friends, from it that I still talk to today.
Even though there's not the discussion with family, there is still the discussion with friends, which is important. I think we always like to highlight that talking through things, not just in a professional capacity with somebody that has the credentials to help you through your journey, but just having other people to talk about things with, whether they were involved in the group or not, is always very helpful. So it's good for us to hear that you do have a very solid set of friends that you can have those conversations with. And I'm sure it's interesting when one of you remembers something and says, oh my goodness, do you remember this? And then you're like, oh, I've forgotten about that.
Exactly. Absolutely. In fact, just recently in preparation for this podcast, I had a couple of discussions with these friends, and they reminded me of a few things that I had forgotten about. And it was really interesting. I even learned some new things too.
For people who haven't gone back to listen to some of the older episodes on the podcast, can you give us sort of a brief introduction into the Worldwide Church of God, how it was founded, where it originated, like a beginner's guide to the faith?
Yes, absolutely. So the Worldwide Church of God was founded in Eugene, Oregon by this man called Herbert W. Armstrong. And he was born in 1892 to Quaker parents, boasted that he was, the descendant of English and Irish royalty, claimed to be a descendant of one of the, quote unquote, lost 10 tribes of Israel, which I think he used to establish some sort of, legitimacy as being, God's end time messenger. Armstrong, as I'll refer to him, was in advertising. That was his career. He was trained in the art of selling, but really didn't have much of a formal education. And how the church came about was that Armstrong attended this church called the Church of God Seventh Day. And the Church of God Seventh Day was an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventists. Along the way, he was ordained as a minister. He then became part of another congregation who was an offshoot of this offshoot, and then eventually ended up founding, his own church. So in 1934, he started the Worldwide Church of God. Now, originally it was called the Radio Church of God, but then soon after he changed the name of that. He then went on to open 3 colleges. I think in the UK, you guys call them universities there. So in 1946, he opened the Ambassador College in Pasadena, California. And at the same time, he moved his headquarters from Eugene, Oregon to Pasadena, California at the same time. So then in 1960, he opened a second college campus, which we didn't really hear much about as members. That was open just outside of London, just a few miles outside of London. I forget the name of that town. But then in 1964, he opened the final college, and that was in Big Sandy, Texas. So these college campuses were basically used to like pump out ministers, and the females that went there were basically, they just went to marry ministers. One thing I'll say about all of these colleges is that none of them were accredited. So if someone decided to go there, their degree just really wasn't legitimate, from what I understand. So I have some stats, if you're interested, about, during the year of 1974, which was around the time that our family joined the cult. Just to show just how big this organization was at the time. They had 2.5 million readers of the Plain Truth magazine. Now, that was a free publication that was available for members and also to recruit.
Is this the free literature that you spoke of your parents accessing before they joined the church?
Absolutely. They had, the cult actually had a few different types of literature that they would provide for free that members, would end up paying for with their tithes. One of them was the Plain Truth magazine. There were other things such as pamphlets. So if people were interested, they would call the phone number that was provided on the radio, the TV broadcast, and they would get these, additional pamphlets that kind of concentrated on one subject. And then occasionally, the leader, Armstrong, would also write, just full books, just really hefty books on, various topics, whether it was prophecy. I think he wrote his own autobiography. Yeah. And, just to touch on how many people were being influenced, by this organization. In 1974, there was 50 million listeners of the World Tomorrow broadcast, and that was across 300 radio stations and 60 TV stations. And I just need to point out that this was worldwide. So this did affect people in various countries. I don't know exactly how many countries, but I think the majority of the radio stations and TV stations that were carrying the broadcast were kind of concentrated in the United States and also the UK.
So Armstrong was kind of like a pioneer of the television evangelists that we see, or televangelists that we see today.
Yes. From what I understand, I actually did end up reading a couple of memoirs over the years, and a couple of other books that kind of outlined this entire organization. But from what I understand, he was a pioneer of bringing some sort of religious message via TV form. So he predated. If I'm, remembering this correctly, he predated all of these other, televangelists that we now see on TV, except that the quality of the broadcast was a little bit better than what you see in televangelists. Not necessarily the message, but I'm talking about, the structure of the program and the quality of the, the magazines and the pamphlets that were provided for free.
And In terms of statistics around the 1970s, is there anything else that you can offer us to kind of highlight what the church was looking like around the time your family joined?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in 1974, there was approximately 250 local congregations belonging to this cult, and this is around the world, but again, most of them were concentrated, in the U.S. It's also my understanding that at the height of cult membership, which I believe was in 1990, attendance in the cult reached approximately 135,000 people worldwide.
Worldwide being not just the Western world, but all over.
Absolutely. Again, I don't remember the exact countries that they reached out to, but they were very interested in obtaining members everywhere and anywhere. I know that there were, churches in Africa. I know that there were, churches in Europe, not just, in the UK.
So was there the opportunity for missionaries to go over to these places to proselytize to communities that hadn't been reached by this point?
Yeah, proselytizing is an interesting topic. I don't know that they specifically sent missionaries. What they did was basically concentrate all the proselytizing into the form of radio and television broadcasts and their free publications. Proselytizing was mainly the responsibility of the leader. That wasn't really something that even pastors and the ministers in the local churches would do. They just basically administered and made sure that the local churches were following the rules.
How does the Worldwide Church of God identify itself? What is unique about this specific movement that separates it from other tangents of Christianity?
I would probably categorize the Worldwide Church of God as a fundamentalist, pseudo-Christian apocalyptic cult that followed Mosaic law, appropriated some Jewish holidays, while also carrying an undertone of racism and misogyny. The cult's doctrine was basically a hodgepodge of principles that were stolen from the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Seventh-day Adventists, Judaism, and British Israelism. But Armstrong staunchly denied that he got any of these ideas from these other groups or ideologies, despite the fact that these particular doctrines, many of which, they were actually aligned with some of these other groups, and they predated Armstrong. Armstrong purported that, he was just never a part of these other groups. And technically that's true. Like with the Seventh-day Adventists, he technically wasn't with the Seventh-day Adventists, but he did grab a lot of his, theological leanings from an offshoot of Seventh-day Adventists, the Church of God Seventh Day.
Well, yeah, this is my kind of next thing, which you've led me into so perfectly and so eloquently, and that is what I've talked about on the show before. Seventh-day Adventism as a faith is so interesting to look at, because it came from Millerism and the Millerite movement. So you've got William Miller, who the Second Great Awakening that happened in the, I think, 1900s. So you've got all of these Baptist churches, Presbyterian churches, and all of a sudden you've got Millerism, and then you've got Armstrongism, and you've got Ellen G. White saying, "Oh no, William Miller, I don't agree with you," and she's like hit on the head with a rock. And then there's Seventh-day Adventism, and then from that you've got this Seventh-day branch that you spoke of, and then you've got the Worldwide Church of God. And then to go even further than that, you've got the Philadelphia Church of God, which again is another tangent that is slightly different, but also quite similar. So Seventh-day Adventism as a subject is absolutely fascinating to look at. And it was so interesting when you started out by kind of overviewing all of that for us and allowing us to see that it's a faith that's come from a faith that's come from a faith that's come from another faith-based group. All of them essentially, they have kind of these little earmarks that make them very similar to one another, but then one or two pieces of doctrine or scripture or interpretation that makes them different in their own right. But what is interesting about all of those things that you said in that previous kind of piece is that there are things in there like observing Sabbath, which I find again really interesting. It kind of doesn't really fit with some of the other things that we look at, like fundamentalist church doctrines and practices. And then you've got kind of Seventh-day Adventism observing Sabbath, and then these other tangents that have come off of the SDA church also kind of saying, well, yeah, well, you know, well, we have some, you know, practices that are inspired by Judaism, but we're not linked to Judaism because we're our own thing. So yeah, just I think interesting to point that out. And for anybody that hasn't listened to any of the previous content, that where we've gone over the SDA church or we've gone over Millerism, and now we've got Armstrongism, it's that I feel like we're kind of approaching maybe the third Great Awakening, and people keep saying it. I've heard Amanda Montell, when she came on the show, author of the book Cultish, she said that it's on its way. And then we had Jeffrey Wallace come on the show. He's like a physically and mentally out Jehovah's Witness who's written a book, and he came on the show to discuss his work, A Voice from the Inside, Notes from a Captive Organization. And he said that it's on its way. So maybe we're coming up to the third Great Awakening, and we'll see lots of people fight over what they believe is the correct way to interpret bits of scripture and lead their faith-based group.
It's very interesting. You know, when you mentioned the SDAs, in recent years, I started learning more about the history of Christianity, especially about, you know, the first and the second, you know, awakening. And in looking at, you know, a lot of the cults that are around today, it seems like the SDA has certainly spawned, you know, directly and indirectly, so many different groups, including, you know, one that I think everyone is probably familiar with, David Koresh, you know, that of course ended very badly.
And we see those types of high controlling groups throughout history start to repeat themselves. And it's only when events like the siege at Waco happen with the Branch Davidians, which again is another offshoot of Seventh-day Adventism,
right,
where a few other people were involved in kind of leading the group. Lois Roden and Benjamin Roden led the Branch Davidians, which was an offshoot of Seventh-day Adventism, and then David Koresh comes along and says, I'm the true leader of this group. He takes over, and through systematic undue influence and awful abuse, some terrible things happened. And right, we see them so much. There's so many things that happened in that situation that you can see in some kingdom halls with Jehovah's Witnesses and some more segregated and insular communities around faith-based groups, but also with things like NXIVM. There are things that are similar, and it unfortunately only seems like when things reach the newspapers or the headlines or the media, or there's a court case or there's celebrities involved, that people start to really take notice. And that's why it's so important that we're having these conversations today, because actually it's all around us all of the time, and we need to be as best equipped to deal with them as possible. And how else can we do that if we're not kind of, you know, taking direct influence and experiences from people such as yourself? So Yeah,
I couldn't
definitely
agree more.
I think
Yeah.
definitely that the Branch Davidians as a sect of Seventh-day Adventism is probably something that the wider community are more familiar with than kind of, the Philadelphia Church of God being an offshoot of the
Right.
Worldwide Church of God.
What's interesting is that, in some ways, as these churches and cults evolve and there's, one offshoot after another, they don't always become better. It seems like all too often there is even more undue influence being placed on its members. And, any one of these groups, including the Worldwide Church of God, could have ended very badly. I think that, under the right conditions, had Armstrong been younger or lived longer, it very well could have, also been catastrophic.
I often wonder if that's the direction that the QAnon movement is going in, and some of these other more radical evangelist movements who are very anti-vax and very much let's keep the congregations together despite the rise in COVID cases and deaths related to people contracting COVID. And again, I wonder if that's leading us back to this third Great Awakening, where it all kind of seems to be lining up in the way that it did in the history books many years ago, even though it wasn't that long ago. And it is worrying to think about.
It is
how much needs to happen, or how little needs to happen for events to repeat themselves in terms of real life harm, real life death, real life mass completion of suicide, and how many of those things are happening right now in insular communities away from the public eye that we just don't know about. It's hard to think about, isn't it?
It is. Yeah. One thing that when I talk about this to people that I know, one thing that I say is that, people don't join cults. People join idealistic groups. People join friendly groups. People join for lots of, sometimes very good and positive reasons. And it isn't until one is in a cult for a while and then, gets to know all of the cult's rules. And sometimes there's even, changes after one joins a cult that, further clamps down on their freedom. But by then they're way into it. And, it can be difficult at that point when people are brainwashed to break free from it, because they really believe that they are, in God's one true church, or in, like in the case of QAnon, the one group that's going to make everything better for the country, make America great again. And so it's amazing what people will end up believing.
That's it, isn't it? People don't join cults, they join answers to life's questions. They join searching for enlightenment. They join looking for a welcoming community when they've moved to a new area. They join people who understand what it's like to lose a loved one. People don't go out in search of cults, and sometimes people on the r/cult subreddit do go out searching for cults. They say there's one in my area, I'm going to infiltrate them and I'm going to learn what I can and I'll report back. And everybody says, please don't do that. Please don't do that. And everybody thinks that their critical thinking is impenetrable or impeccable enough that they won't be kind of influenced. But as we know, influence exists all around us. And if you're told something enough, if your guard is down, even a little bit, then you could just be swooped up. I don't recommend
Yeah.
doing that. Anybody that's listening and thinking about doing that, please don't do that.
I agree. I mean, one of the things that I've learned, over the years, formally and informally, through education, is that anybody, can fall victim to a cult. It's not just one type of person. It's not just somebody who is, weak or wants someone else to, control their life, or doesn't have their own ideas and beliefs. Anybody can fall victim of a cult. It just takes the right ingredients, getting them at the right time in the right place.
I think Bob Menner summed it up in one of the episodes that I've just released recently. He said, it's actually saved as a quote on my home screen, so I can get to it really quickly, but I thought it was really insightful. And it said that, he said, it has nothing to do with you or your willpower or your beliefs or your smarts, your street smarts or whatever. If the right person with the right talent finds you at the right time, they've got you. And when he said that, I thought, wow, that is it. And he said that you've had the unfortunate luck to come into contact with a con man or a con woman. And as you said at the start, Armstrong had a career in selling things to people.
That's right.
Which I thought was interesting.
Yeah. For one of my graduate classes, we did a lot of case studies we did a lot of case studies that included a variety of different cults. And there just seemed to be certain themes that kept coming up with cult leaders. And one of them is, either some sort of creativity in their job description. They're actors and, Hollywood, wannabes. In fact, Herbert W. Armstrong's son was, if I recall correctly, he was a failed Hollywood wannabe. He wanted to make it in Hollywood and then didn't. And then when he had a riff with his father, Herbert W. Armstrong, he went off and started his own church. I believe that one was called Church of God International. So that's like a whole nother, cult that, stems from Worldwide Church of God.
Church of God International. And interesting that you said about the trying to make it in Hollywood, because I've just done a huge segment, hours of work around Charles Manson, and I just can't seem to get away from Charles Manson at the moment. I've just done a huge research piece on Aleister Crowley, because I wanted to look at the Church of Satan and Anton LaVey, and you can't look at Anton LaVey without looking at Aleister Crowley, because a lot of the influences for the Church of Satan came from Aleister Crowley. So I've been looking at Aleister Crowley, who spent time in San Francisco, which is where Manson recruited some of the women that followed him, and where he dabbled in early psychedelics and the big counterculture movement. And then I was looking at the Church of Satan, which was founded, and the Black House existed in San Francisco. So everything's like connected.
Yeah.
And it's kind of
Manson wanted to he was trying to make it big in music, I believe, and flipped out basically when he couldn't, and hence the murders.
Yep. And when he didn't get his own way and felt like he was owed something, or his own sense of self and ego and importance needed to be directed somewhere, that energy and those efforts went towards the people that followed him so devoutly. And so if Herbert W. Armstrong's son is not getting what he thinks he deserves from his career in Hollywood, or his father, perhaps he's doing the same thing that Manson did and looking for a way to get that reverence or popularity or time in the spotlight that maybe he thinks he is owed. I don't know anything about the Church of God International, so I'm kind of just throwing things out there with my cult tinted glasses, assuming that everybody is nefarious, which is probably not fair. But I might also be on the mark, so it's hard to say.
Yeah. Well, cult leaders are, notoriously narcissistic. There's a whole list of, traits that many of them, not all of them, but many of them, do have. And, a big one is narcissism. We see that play out, in a lot of cults.
So how big would you say was your congregation when you were growing up? Did it change in size a lot? Did it remain the same? Is it one of these environments where people grew up there as children and still go today as grandparents? Without giving too much away, can you give us an idea of what your church looked like?
Yeah, I probably should also say that the Worldwide Church of God no longer exists in the form that it once did. So there is, no one in that church currently, but for the children or grandchildren that wanted to, whether they were first generation, second, third, and they wanted to remain in that sort of, in that environment, with those doctrines, they ended up going to one of the various offshoots. And there are several, not just the Philadelphia Church of God. I believe there's also United Church of God. And, even before Worldwide ended, there's the Church of God International, and there are others. Officially, Worldwide Church of God operated under that name through the year 2009. And then it was changed to Grace Communal International. So what happened was that Armstrong died in 1986. I was still in high school. And then Armstrong's successor, Joseph DeKotch, took over. And after a couple of years, about 1988, 1989, he started making some doctrinal changes slowly at first, and then they really ramped up, if I'm not mistaken, like around the year 1994, 1995. But by the time that the church was renamed to Grace Communion International in 2009, the church itself would probably be more aptly categorized as an evangelical church that transformed its fringe Christian beliefs to kind of fall more in line with Orthodox Christianity. So there are all these, local congregations. Back to your question, while growing up, I attended probably about 4 or 5 different ones, depending on where we lived, because we lived in different states. And from what I recall, each congregation had about a few hundred people, give or take 100, whether it's, 150, 400, somewhere around there. It was enough to, to make friends, have a lot of, kids around and make friends, and enough for the parents really to, the adults, I would call them, to really kind of, find their group of friends and, and have different groups, within the church that they socialized with.
And also enough to not feel like the entire faith is about to just kind of die out.
Right, exactly. I think that, a congregation that is much smaller, 20 people, 15 people, what have you, would seem a little bit more cultish, probably, for somebody who was just walking in and didn't really know, anything, about that particular church. So it definitely seemed like it was vibrant, it was alive, it was growing.
400 people, that's a huge amount of people to have in one congregation. And on holy celebrations and holy days and church related activities, I'm sure that there were like yearly events where people got together and big pushes for tithe and whatnot, that it must not have felt that in the next sort of 10 to 15 years, you'd all be looking for various offshoots of the Worldwide Church of God to go and join in place of this congregation with 400 plus people attending different events.
Absolutely. One thing I missed saying before was that while our congregation had, give or take a few hundred people, we had a sister congregation that maybe was about an hour away. And the reason it was considered a sister congregation was because the same set of pastors, so a pastor and an assistant pastor, would, were responsible for both of these churches. So I remember our sister congregation having, a little bit less than our church, in particular, our congregation. But on holidays, which they called Holy Days, we would get together. And so then, both churches were in one building, and there were a lot more people, and for me, that was always really exciting because I made friends in both congregations, and it was great to, finally catch up and spend time with the friends in the sister congregation. And then when it came to the really big holidays, the biggest one was the Feast of Tabernacles, which we called, the feast. There were certain sites around the world and in the United States that gathered literally thousands of people together under one roof for that celebration. I mean, I couldn't meet everyone if I tried.
If those types of celebrations still exist today in other tangents and offshoots of Seventh-day Adventism, how do you think those holy days look today with the pandemic and people being advised to remain socially distanced? Do you have any insight in what those things look like?
Not terribly. I do know that prior to the pandemic, there are some offshoots of worldwide that still do celebrate, these holy days, like, the Feast of Tabernacles, and we can get into, the specifics on the holy days if you want to as well. But from what I understand, the attendance at those really are a lot less than the Worldwide Church of God. So there's a lot less people going to those. I don't know how they're operating now during the pandemic, but I would not be surprised if they're still gathering, especially the stricter ones who consider gathering for these holy days a commandment. It's a mandate from God to get together.
I think you mentioned something in your writing to me originally about vaccinations and the church's stance on vaccinations. And I know that's a little bit further on our question list, but it feels like a good time to go into maybe how the church viewed medical interventions and vaccinating against different viruses and conditions.
Yeah. So vaccinations and, conventional medicine in general, they were not explicitly forbidden, but they did instill a skepticism about the medical community in general, and they did preach against vaccinations. However, it was sold as being a choice that a member had to make. So in the late 1970s, there was this emphasis on just following a healthy lifestyle. And this was in addition to the dietary, laws that absolutely had to be followed. I distinctly remember that the mothers in the cult had a shift towards making food at home from scratch, such as yogurt or whole wheat bread. And, doing so at a time when it wasn't really mainstream in society to do that, like it is now. We ditched white bread for wheat bread. And, in an effort to promote a healthy lifestyle, I recall that rejecting vaccines was also a part of living this healthy lifestyle, because vaccines are not natural. And if you did get vaccinated, it probably meant that you did not have faith in God to do his part in response to you doing your part. So because vaccinations were not specifically forbidden, it led to varying levels of adherence among the members. I grew up with kids who were not vaccinated and kids who were vaccinated in the cult. Personally, I think, because I've thought about why didn't they just mandate it and make it, a must, like so many, of these other musts. Personally, I think that the strategy the cult adopted, to guilt the membership into, this direction was a matter of liability. I think that making it a choice, albeit a very pressured choice by members, relieved the cult of potentially facing future legal battles like some other cults were facing if someone died, as a result of not providing medical care, especially for their children. So I think that the strategy here was to get as many people as possible to voluntarily reject vaccinations. And it did work, at least for many members, although not all. The cult also made it easy for members to not vaccinate their children. They provided official religious exemption forms for all members who wanted to get their kids into school without vaccinations. I was not vaccinated. But my family still went to conventional doctors at the time. But, like some other members, we also incorporated alternative medicines, some quacks, who did not have any medical degrees. And also there seemed to be an over-reliance on like vitamins and herbs as, part of our health routine.
And you mentioned the dietary requirements within the church, and we've already mentioned that there is some inspiration from the different sects of Judaism and Judaism as a faith. So was it a kosher-based diet that you're expected to follow within the Worldwide Church of God?
Yeah, we were required to observe the Jewish kashrut laws in the Bible on what to eat and not eat. They used Jewish scriptures, in the Torah, Genesis specifically, to outline what animals were permissible to eat and not permissible. So we could eat animals that chewed the cud and had a cloven hoof. This doesn't include pigs, but cows were okay. We couldn't eat fish that didn't have scales, so no bottom feeders, no clams, mussels, shrimp, lobster, no catfish. They don't have scales. No eels or any other fish that didn't have scales. These dietary laws, Armstrong told us, wasn't just for the Jews. They were for God's people, and that included us as well.
Were you accustomed to these dietary restrictions before you joined the church, or was it a big change for you and your family?
For me, it was not a big change because I was a young toddler. And so I don't recall eating differently. I just don't have any memories of a life basically prior to the cult, prior to observing these holy days and not observing other holidays, as, we were told that we couldn't do. I don't remember eating pork or anything like that. From what my parents have told me over the years, it was a little bit of an adjustment to them. It's my understanding that one of my parents really loved pork chops. And, for them, it was a little bit of a sacrifice. But, for God, I guess you're willing to do, anything, even give up pork.
And you mentioned briefly the holy days that were celebrated within the congregation and throughout the church worldwide. And you mentioned that you'd be able to go into some detail about each one. So I wondered if you could maybe start in January and work your way through the calendar year.
I'll try to summarize some of them. basically, we were to celebrate all of the Jewish holidays, which we called holy days, but only those that were, explicitly mentioned in the Jewish Bible. So Passover, Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, Sukkot, but by their English name equivalents. So, it was the Day of Atonement, not Yom Kippur. It was the Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of Tabernacles, which I touched on, briefly before. We did not, however, celebrate anything that was not in the Jewish scriptures specifically. Like Hanukkah is not mentioned in the Jewish scriptures. That is, a Jewish holiday that came after those scriptures were written. So no Hanukkah, no Purim. So, basically what Armstrong did was, he appropriated those Jewish holidays and kind of added a fundamentalist messianic meaning that he kind of layered over these days. So while we celebrated it, it wasn't in the way or with the same meaning that the Jewish people would celebrate these holidays. They also, they always pointed to some sort of messianic end of world, future world, the world tomorrow scenario. So definitely that messianic undertone to each of them.
Before we skipped right ahead, we kind of glazed over some of the stuff that I know you had some great responses to around some definitions of some of the practices within the Worldwide Church of God, and like some of the inspiration apparently came from British Israelism. And I wondered if you could just tell us specifically what that is, as opposed to Israelism in itself, and how British Israelism is different.
So let me try to do the best I can here and summarize. British Israelism, also known as, the British Israelite theory, is kind of the precursor to what some now might know as Christian identity that emerged in the 1920s and 30s, and, associated with, several current day white supremacist groups. Before it evolved into, the more overtly racist Christian identity movement, British Israelism existed for quite some time. Some sources indicate that this theory has been around since the 1600s. Armstrong's specific flavor of British Israelism was taken from a man named Richard Brothers, who lived around the year 1800. And British Israelism is the belief that the tribes of Israel, as mentioned in the Jewish Bible, are not all the ancestors of the Jews today. The Jews today are descendants of only one of those tribes, Judah, and the other tribes were, quote unquote, lost. They wandered around and they ended up in England and are now the Anglo-Saxon people of today. So, the implication of this belief is racist in nature. How it pertains to, the holidays and many practices is that white Europeans and their descendants, along with Jews, although to a lesser degree, are considered God's people. And therefore, they are the rightful inheritors of the birthright, meaning they're God's chosen ones. From a theological perspective, this is really a foundational doctrine for this cult, because it really lays the groundwork for a lot of the other practices and beliefs. If you believe that the Jewish Bible is meant for the Anglo-Saxons and not the Jews, and then you add this messianic component, especially when that's apocalyptic, you get a cult that looks more or less like this one.
And I can see there what you meant by undertones of racism kind of coming through there, and elitism and the kind of superior race complex and things like that are extremely problematic. And we know that from events that have happened in history, which we have talked about on the show. And again, kind of poses that question around where do we draw the line and say that something is wrong in like persecuting a particular community group or ethnicity. And it comes back to that us versus them part of Stephen Hassan's Bite model that we've looked at in depth, where you say, you know, that there's kind of white people versus any other ethnicity, and then the Worldwide Church of God versus the Philadelphia Church of God, and the Seventh-day Adventists, and even the Church of God International, the Armstrong Son went on to start, and then you've got probably even competitiveness amongst various congregations, and one feast of the tabernacle being more successful than another one, which happened in a different, you know, maybe in the Midwest of America as opposed to the East Coast. And where does it stop? Where does this, and then the purity culture that comes with the congregations means that there is competitiveness and ego amongst congregants themselves, and how modest they can be and how devout they can be and how much they can tithe. And even though we are encouraged to let go of competitiveness and ego, and we are supposed to be as modest on the outside as we are on the inside, all of those things are played on in a lot of these faith-based groups on account of creating an atmosphere that generates more tithing and generates more devoutness and generates less contact with worldly people, in case it should impede on their spiritual relationship with God, and therefore make them less devout, and therefore make them less faithful than the other woman in the church or the other men in the church that they are kind of silently competing with. And maybe that's not the case with the Worldwide Church of God, but it's certainly a common thread that we have discussed at length in other faith-based groups, especially other Christian faith-based groups that have come through and been spoken about on the show.
There's a social dynamic that I learned in grad school, actually not too long ago, that explains this very thing. And it exists in various types of groups, but you really see it, you know, how it plays out in cults. And it's called social proof. And that, I think, is what you're describing. The cult itself has, you know, its own rules and things that they must follow. But this competitiveness, this trying to one up each other, this trying to figure out how to be the best, you know, the best of God's little servants. This is explained by, you know, social proof. And that's, you know, this inertia that is created amongst, you know, a group of people. I mean, when I did a case study with Heaven's Gate, it was very, you know, it was very evident there. Yes, you know, the group had certain rules, but then at some point, it was the members of that group that were then initiating further, you know, rules and steps to take in order to remain pure. It was the members one of the members, I believe, who, you know, initiated the thought about getting castrated. That did not come from the top down, that came from the bottom up. So that's, you know, that's a really important concept, social proof.
And it was also seen with the Manson family, where some of Manson's followers approached him and said, why don't we reenact the Gary Hinman murder and make it look like it was something to do with the racial tensions in that part of America. And therefore, you know, Bobby Beausoleil, who had actually murdered Gary Hinman, who had been arrested on suspicion of murder, would get released, and they could blame it all on the people of color, and they could start the race war themselves that Manson was convinced was going to come, which is kind of linking again back to this apocalyptic cult that you mentioned at the start of the episode. And so we do see Manson kind of like, okay, then I'll get on board with that. And then, you know, with Marshall Applewhite, he's kind of like, yeah, do you know what? I'll get castrated as well. And then you're like, where has this come from? So that's a really interesting phenomenon that I think we should look at more. Social proofing. And I have a bad habit on this show of either not knowing what the name of the effect is called, which social proofing seems to be what it was that I was trying to describe, or explaining the same thing in 5 different ways until the guest that I'm speaking with says, I think you mean one very clean, concise sentence that summarizes my point. And that's exactly what you've done. So, similarly to the dissertation that I wrote for my university course, where I talked about not social proofing, but self-policing, where prison systems in America specifically, there's been research done that shows that they are set up in such a way that segregates ethnicities and gangs, so that the Caucasian prisoners are worried about mixing with the people in the prison that are Mexican. And if the Caucasian people step into the Mexican territory, then there is potentially murder. And then there is the Asian community that separates itself from the Caucasian community and the Mexican community. And again, if they use each other's toilets or get caught in each other's showers, then because of the way that the community is set up within prison, that is grounds for a brutal attack or a shiv to actually end a person's life, you know, from something as small as using a particular shower cubicle. And there was a documentary I watched, and I can't remember, this was about 10 years ago now, but it was almost like an indoor sports hall that had been set up to have like 8 sections. So 4 sections on one side of the hall, 4 sections on another, bunk beds in each of these 8 sections. And in each section lived a different community group. And they were completely segregated, self-segregated from one another. And they were so worried about what they were doing that they were watching each other rather than watching the guards, who were treating the population of inmates horribly. Very exploitative of their positions of power, making money off of backhanded deals and drugs that were going around the prison. And the inmates were so focused on each other and watching every step of each you know, segregated community, that they weren't thinking, hang on a minute, why are the guards getting away with this? Why are they doing that? And so the self-policing phenomenon means that the guards don't have to worry about the prisoners or riots or anything like that, because they're all busy watching each other instead of watching the guards. And I can see in some ways why that would be beneficial, because if a whole room full of inmates did decide to riot, I imagine that it would be difficult for a very small amount of staff members working in a prison to defend themselves. You know, if things happened spontaneously in a situation or scenario where the staff weren't able to get to a place where they could protect themselves. You know, there's loads of different scenarios we could talk about. And
divide and conquer, right? You know,
absolutely,
divide and conquer, because if we let an entire group of people get together, they definitely outnumber, the ruling ones. Now, I mean, I see this parallel, right, in our Western society, and certainly in others as well, where currently we're experiencing group rising up against group, ethnic group, political group, separated by class, and there's the advantaged and the ones who are not advantaged. We're so concerned, as a society, in choosing our own, choosing a side, that we're kind of letting, the Jeff Bezos and the Elon Musks of the world, send themselves to space and yet not do their part in society, pay all their taxes, or, what have you. So our own focus is not really on, our oppressors, it's on each other.
Absolutely. People are so worried about anti-guns and pro-guns, and why I should be allowed to keep my guns, or why you shouldn't be allowed to have guns, and statistics around mass shootings, and then people that believe they didn't even happen, and reasons why the mass shootings are just conspiracies. And then there's people that will come up with statistics on how many home shootings a year are by accident, by children who find these loose firearms around the home. So even that in itself is a big question in America at the moment, that is dividing
huge
community groups, and dividing and again, people aren't looking at what's going on with government. It happens all the time over here, and it's that's something that has happened for as long as we can, as far back as we can even begin to understand, read about, educate ourselves, as far back as the history books go. You can see that these types of tactics have been in place. And I understand that the prison discussion is not particularly relevant to cult movements and groups, but it was interesting for me to learn about the self-policing method, and how actually there are a lot of methodologies involved in cult-like methods of control that are translated and transferable into everyday situations. I know a prison situation is not an everyday situation, but there are things that we read about in relationships of emotional abuse, physical abuse, and relationships of people that were raised by narcissistic parenting. There are tactics that are common amongst these high demand religious groups that are easily identifiable in situations where people have experienced trauma, abuse. And I always like to draw on those parallels where we find them, because I feel like if somebody was to meet a girl and fall in love with them, and then she says, I grew up in a cult, and somebody says, how on earth am I supposed to ever relate to that? Because I didn't even realize that cults existed, like air quotes, in the real world, not just on true crime documentaries that come on the Stars channel or however people consume their true crime documentaries. But they might be able to say to themselves, oh, well, I don't understand your full story, but I did grow up experiencing this one thing or that one thing. And self-policing is something that is used even in school. You're encouraged to tell your teacher if a student or pupil is doing something that they shouldn't be doing. And so that person is so worried about their classmates that they don't go and do those things that they're not supposed to do. And so society is based off of these small methodologies that are implemented. And of course, things like whistleblowing must exist so that people are held accountable for things that they shouldn't be doing wrong. But a lot of the time, the self-policing is used in situations where people aren't doing anything wrong. And what you said there about seeing the self-policing happen everywhere with people's beliefs and opinions on what they think is right or wrong is easily
this us and them, this us versus them mentality. I think it's fine to take a position on something. It's fine to to have a position on various topics, especially, the more important ones, guns, for instance, how you're going to, view the world, through what lens, do you have this religious lens, if so, which one, if any? But it's this us versus them, I'm in the one group, in the one ideology that is perfect, or has all of the truth, or, is the only group of people that my God loves. That really presents a problem, especially as we see these offshoots of churches, these cults that step away from Orthodox Christianity. Let's say there's many different religions, but if we were to just focus on Christianity itself, all these groups that really, unfortunately, in many cases, these offshoots, these cults, just serve to further separate people from other people, and really lessen the mind, lessen our ability to think critically.
And there you have the social proofing and self-policing working hand in hand, so that leaders of congregations or religious groups don't need to do the groundwork anymore, because the congregants will do it for them by this point, if their aim is to create a mass of unquestioning, devout followers, which is often what comes from these very meticulous methods that are implemented in these high demand religious groups. And
we're watching each other, we're helping out the cult. If you run into a cult member, in the world, quote unquote, as we used to say, and they had makeup on, we weren't allowed to wear makeup. So that was, hey, somebody needs to know that, you need to report that, because this person is being a hypocrite, and certainly, not one of God's children. And we can't have this satanic influence, in our midst.
And I do appreciate and respect that in some cases, there will be people who genuinely and truly believe that they must inform somebody in a higher position of this person's
act of disobedience, if it's part of a cult. I totally get it. In order to get the cult to function well, you brainwash the members to do things like report on each other. But at the same time, a lot of these rules are not, unethical. It's not breaking the rules, rather, is not unethical. And perhaps it would be easier for people in certain cults to leave, and kind of spread their wings and get to, realize their authentic selves, if they were allowed to, break the rules. But then you don't have a cohesive, tight-knit, highly controlled cult.
Absolutely. And I think you're exactly on the money there when you say, if people are allowed to recognize their individualism then half of these conversations wouldn't happen. But of course, individuality is not something that you need to be a child of God, because to do God's work, there you just need to be a follower of God. There's no need for you to be an individual in a lot of these high demand religious groups, which is extremely unfortunate, because and again, back to Aleister Crowley, who basically just said, like, anything that makes us happy in life is considered a sin. So if I want to be close to God, I basically just have to live a life of unhappiness, which I'm not prepared to do. So I'm just going to do the opposite and become the most selfish person on earth. And I can see why some of these overzealous parents would drive their children to have those thoughts and feelings. But, you know, if I was wearing makeup outside of church-related activities and someone kind of spotted me on the street and then decided that it was their spiritual duty to inform somebody, and then I was berated or however that looked in your particular congregation for wearing makeup, then that person may feel spiritually justified in their actions and may feel like they've actually done me and themselves a favor, because that now we're all closer to God through being purer and following the rules, which of course have been interpreted by man. That is a whole conversation in itself. But also I feel like these situations allow for a breeding ground of smugness and competitiveness that is different to somebody who honestly and genuinely thinks that they must inform somebody of your actions to not only make themselves purer, but you also. And some of the people I've spoken to on the show from their high demand religious groups have spoken about having one parent in the church and one parent not in the church, which you mentioned briefly earlier, and how at birthdays and Christmases, which we'll talk about in a little while, they would actually put a chair out and say, you know, oh, Dad, you can't sit there. This chair's for God. And without trying and without saying, you know, you need to come to church, you need to be saved, there'd be very subtle messages from the children, like, come on, Dad, get on board, because we're really genuinely, you know, and this one person I interviewed, she would have nightmares about what would happen to her father because he just didn't want to be a part of the church. And children who are fed this fire and brimstone message from, you know, as early as they can learn, read, look at pictures, and then to think that is going to be what happens to your father must be absolutely terrifying. One side where people are kind of snitching, self-policing for their own spiritual benefit, but then I feel like it opens up doors for people to do it maliciously, smugly, competitively, which obviously is not in keeping with the overall message of church practices, you know, to be as modest on the inside as you are on the outside. If you're doing that in a competitive way or a smug way, then you're actually very ugly and almost manipulative on the inside. But then, of course, you could just say, it's my spiritual duty to bring this information to the leaders. So how could you ever be held accountable for joining in with the mental gymnastics in that situation?
Yeah, it's a very difficult position to be in. Something that you mentioned about, you know, people being smug. Some of the best people that I know have joined cults, and some of the worst people that I know, you know, have joined cults. There are, people who genuinely are looking for, to be enlightened, to live this, a more meaningful life that perhaps they were not able to get in Orthodox Christianity, which is completely understandable. And, some people, including, one of my parents, is genuinely wanting to be a good person and be the best person that they can be. But on the other hand, I know people who, are or were in this cult in particular, who really, I had no idea why they're in that cult. They were just extremely egotistical, extremely smug, almost got joy from just like emotionally or verbally abusing their children and abusing other people. And I just didn't understand it, because if you're in a particular church or cult and what you're searching for is salvation, you would think that you would choose something, a lot easier. Like I think I would go with Catholicism, because I could just like show up on Sunday. I could, ask for forgiveness, and I can go back to my, to my daily life. But, in this cult, you had to jump through so many hoops for salvation. And it was basically, the cumulative work of your life. I don't think that I would attempt this cult if there was so much that I needed to fix, about myself.
Some of the other practices that you mentioned in your writing to me that also kind of align themselves with Judaism allude more to this particular group being a very high demand religious group, as opposed to something like Catholicism, as you mentioned there, where you would go for Sunday, and then you'd go, to like Christmas Eve midnight mass and say prayer before meal times. And I didn't know if you just wanted to talk us through some of those other high demand practices that are included in the Worldwide Church of God.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the practices which was very burdensome was tithing. It wasn't just 10% like a lot of, I'm guessing, Protestant churches require. It was a total of 30% of one's gross salary. At that, some of the other practices were basically they did not allow us to celebrate what they considered the world's holidays. So this included Halloween, Christmas, Easter, Valentine's Day, even birthdays. So in that sense, that came from the Jehovah's Witnesses. Some other practices were, modestly dressing, especially for women. Women weren't, I mentioned, couldn't wear makeup until a certain year, until after Armstrong died. So clothing and hair had to conform to like traditional gender expectations. So men should have short hair, they couldn't have long hair. Women, they could have any length hair, but it couldn't be so short as to be confused as being a man's haircut. So, the hair had to cover the ears. That was, kind of like a general rule. Some other rules that kind of seem more like fundamentalism and evangelicals, no divorce, except for very rare occasions. And it had to be approved by the ministry, no premarital sex, no masturbation. And then there were these other things like salvation and just various terms and ideas that, they used terms that Orthodox Christians use, such as, faith, baptism, repentance, sanctification, resurrection. But the definitions of those were very different from Orthodox Christianity, which is something that occurs in many cults. They use a terminology that is familiar, but they switch up the definitions. So, for instance, baptism was really about that was likened to being conceived. So if you're baptized, you're not born again, but you're conceived. The final step, which is like resurrection in this whole salvation process, that was when your body, became spirit, and that was the definition of being born again. And really entering the God family. So, another thing is, they didn't believe in the Trinity. Instead, God was a God family. And one day after, we die and get resurrected, we too are going to be part of that God family, almost like, little demigods, I guess, running around telling other people what to do. Prior to being part of the cult, Armstrong, for many years predicted end times, and that the end times is going to start in 1972, at latest 1975, but that the work of God through him was going to end at 72. And then at that point, there was going to be, the Great Tribulation that was going to, last 3.5 years and such. And he made all these predictions that the US was going to, suffer through natural disasters and droughts, and that basically the faithful in the US and in Britain were going to suffer martyrdom, get sent off to concentration camps. Obviously, none of this happened in 1972, 1975. So, we joined this cult kind of like on the heels of that. And my recollection is that, the end time, the apocalypse, that was imminent. Like that could happen any day. But they stopped using specific dates. And I think that really helped with their membership, shooting up from there.
I do remember reading back on several movements where there have been doomsday prophecies, and when they haven't come to light, there have been excuses about using the human calendar instead of the astrological calendar, or the Mayan calendar, or we are moving faster than the biblical calendar, so we're actually like 50 years behind, and all these strange reasonings. And often that is where we have seen branches of these movements be implemented, where people have said, okay, well, you clearly don't know what you're talking about, so I'm going to take some followers and create my own group. But then sometimes it's strengthened the message, which is hard for me to understand, because a lot of people would sell their houses, their cars, leave their jobs, and leave themselves with nothing, because they thought that they were going to be ascending, to a higher place, through the actual real occurrence of the end of the world. And I can't imagine how that must feel for a person to go through that, selling all of their earthly goods, worldly goods, leaving their job, selling their home, especially if there's a family to support, to then realize, a few days after the prophesized date that it's not happening.
Right. And I'm sure that occurred in the Worldwide Church of God, but I don't know any stories of that. And because my parents joined kind of on the heels of that, we personally did not go through that. But there was this idea that sort of thing was going to happen in the future. And we certainly had to, be prepared for that. Armstrong chose, there's a couple of things I would say about that. I believe it was around this time, 1975, that his son, Garner Todd Armstrong, that's when he went off and, and did his own thing. So, your comment there kind of prompted that in me, that memory. Another thing is that Armstrong believed in just kind of like this religious numerology. I don't even know if that's the right term or not, but, cycles of 3 and 7 and 12 and 19 and 40. And I'm sure there's like a lot of other numbers. But one of the reasons he came up with the 1972 prediction was because it's 2 19-year cycles from the time that he started the church in 1934. So he thought, for whatever reason, 2 19-year cycles, 1972 is the day. That's the year.
At this particular point in history, it sounds like Armstrong truly believed that he was a messenger for God and had really, truly worked out the date for this big event to happen, because you'd be surely a fool to go onto a public platform where you had that much attention and focus on you to lead the people in the right direction, to then come out with something that you've pulled out of the air and made up. Surely he must have truly believed that at the time. Otherwise, he knew he'd be left with sort of egg on his face when nothing happened. Again, I'm speculating because I have not read enough about Armstrong and never met him in person to ask him. And I don't think he would ever reveal the truth, even if anybody did have the opportunity to have that conversation. But
that is a phenomenon that happens actually with cult leaders. And for the life of me, I can't remember the name of this, aspect in psychology. But there, some of them who go into, the cult business or the church business, as I like to say, they may start off as being, con artists, and then they end up believing their own lies. And it's this, I don't know, it to me, it's mental illness takes over. But it is an actual, phenomenon that occurs with cult leaders.
I think, again, just because I've been reading so much about it, and it's so easy to go back to, it happened again with Manson, who felt as if through his stories and the way that everybody else has spoken about him, he kind of sounded like he was making it up as he goes along. Originally, through all the time that he spent in the prison system and learning about how to pimp women, it started off like a business for him and a way for him to make money. It was to lure vulnerable women in and basically have sexual relations with them himself, but also use them as a way to make himself more money. But as time went on and he formed these ideas, and then the use of psychedelics and hallucinogens came in, and then at some point when the Beatles' White Album was released, he listened to it and genuinely believed that the Beatles were telling him that he was the fifth Beatle, and they were sending subliminal messages through their music, through their words and references to strange things. And Manson would make these wild connections and truly believe that the Beatles were trying to send him messages all the way over in America through their music, through the White Album, which again is such a strange notion, but alludes to what you just said there about the phenomenon that happens with cult leaders who say something and then eventually come to believe it themselves, even if at the start of it they didn't really believe what they were saying. They were just trying to sell themselves. And I think you can see that happen with other religious leaders as well, with Jim Jones in some of the documentaries where you can listen to him give these very lengthy charismatic speeches where he talks about the government coming to persecute them, that the government are coming to tear them apart, that their community is going to be taken from them, that people can't understand what they are trying to build because it's not segregated, that Jim Jones was a big voice for desegregation, and that he'd done a lot of work around being inclusive of community groups that included different ethnicities in that time in America, which was extremely rare, especially in church-based activities, to see a very mixed congregation. And it's almost like he was saying that as a way to keep his members scared to stay with him, to not go back to their segregated churches elsewhere, but to stay in this inclusive community. And then when Leo Ryan showed up to actually go and look at Jonestown and Jim Jones was just using so many drugs at that point and kind of performing these false mass suicide drills and white nights and all of these things, that when a politician from the government, like when a congressman actually showed up, all of a sudden he's like, well, here they are. The politicians are actually here now the government are here to take away our community. And his last speech, you know, if anybody's ever gone back and listened to it, is absolutely haunting. And it was almost like in that moment, all of those things that he'd been saying the whole time to sell to his congregants had actually come into, you know, it had actually come to fruition. So it's very, I think it's a phenomenon that you can pinpoint with some of the more documented cult leaders throughout history, where that exact thing has definitely happened.
Right. I remembered what it was. It's it falls under the psychology of self-deception, you know, something as simple as that. I don't know why I forgot that, but yeah, that was, you know, that's definitely something that a lot of cult leaders have, and they start to believe their own lies, and they ramp it up, and some of them get paranoid, you know, and do some very drastic things.
Some of the other practices that you mentioned in your writing is that the church did observe Sabbath. Is that right?
That is true. So they observed the Sabbath on Saturday, like the Jews and the Seventh-day Adventists.
And when you say Feast of Tabernacle is a weird, strange word to me, and I don't know why, but in my head, I think of tentacle whenever somebody says tabernacle. So in my head, I'm thinking it's some kind of word for that's been translated like through tentacles, but actually it just means like a meeting place of worship or like a place of worship.
Yeah, we were told they were temporary dwelling places, and so in order for us to celebrate that holy day, or set of holy days, actually, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but it lasted 8 days, with the first day and the last day being what they considered high holy days. You know, you had to treat those days like they were the Sabbath. You couldn't do anything fun, and couldn't do any work then. And then in between the first and the last day, it was more like a regular day. It was a holy day, but not a high holy day. And so, you know, anyone who's familiar with Jewish practices, they do not go away and you know, celebrate the Feast of Tabernacles. For them, it's called Sukkot. But this cult, what they would do is that, and it was a highlight of the year, by the way, this week-long festival in the fall. It required us to go to one of a variety of feast sites that were provided around the world. I mean, I remember going to Florida and going to Pennsylvania and, you know, going to North Carolina for these, you know, feast sites. So, I mean, although it was a Jewish holiday, so they layer this messianic meaning for this holiday. And the feast was supposed to symbolize just how wonderful the world would be once Christ returns and begins, you know, the millennium, his 1,000-year reign, which the cult called The World Tomorrow, you know, same name as the telecast or the broadcast. So, you know, during this time, the cult encouraged parents to treat this time kind of like a vacation, like Christmas and birthday, just like all wrapped up into one. And we were required to go to church services every morning for 2 hours. And then the rest of the day was kind of free time when we'd be able to, you know, spend time with family, do entertaining things. You know, I remember doing things like mini golfing and movies and hanging out with friends and, family dinners out, that sort of thing. Things that you couldn't afford on a daily basis throughout the year. And the idea was, this is how wonderful life will be after Jesus returns. It's not going to be like the daily grind that you're having to live, in right now.
And you mentioned then Christmases and birthdays and how there were other religious events that kind of reflected or took the place of some of those more Christian celebrated events, such as Christmas and Easter. So Christmas and birthdays for you didn't look like it might for the typical person living in America?
Absolutely not. We were not, not only did we not celebrate Christmas, at all, but to go one step further, we weren't even allowed to accept gifts that other people would give us, like my non-cult family. If they were to give us gifts on Christmas, my parents would return that. We did not accept Christmas gifts. We did not accept birthday gifts. And, even when I went to school, if the school had some sort of, Christmas pageant, or there was like a little Christmas or a birthday party in my class, my parents made sure that the school pulled me out of, pulled me out of classes during that time. And so, so that I wouldn't be a part of that, because, the cult thought that these holidays were of pagan origin. And, they wanted to separate themselves from anything that was pagan. They thought that, the world was run by Satan. Satan had control of all of these systems, governments, holidays, and we were to live in the world, quote unquote, in the world, but we weren't to be a part of the world. And that meant abstaining from all of these things.
So there's so much that I think is important to discuss in what you said. First of all, the lack of celebration around birthdays goes back to not allowing us that individualism that we spoke about before. I think we should all have a right to be celebrated on our birthdays. I think we should all have people around us that are thankful for our existence, and that one day a year is the 364 days since that you've gone around the sun, and you're still here, and people should celebrate the fact that you exist. So again,
I completely agree. I completely agree. But that was part of, like you said, removing the individualism, because it's not about you. So they always try to de-emphasize you and celebrating you. It's all about God and what God mandates and what God expects, and nothing is about you.
So even though you'd grown up knowing that it's not a thing that happens, celebrating your birth in the way that it might happen for some of your peers in school, did you understand that, or were you resentful of the fact that you didn't have a birthday? Because you joined the church so young, you probably didn't have memories of having a birthday before then. You talked about having non-cult family members. So, did you ever witness other family members celebrating their birthdays and wonder why you didn't have that for yourself? Or did you kind of just go, well, I don't know what it's like to celebrate a birthday, so I'm not really that bothered?
Yeah, a little bit of all of it. For the most part, I joined so young that I didn't have anything taken away from me, in my opinion, because I don't remember those first few birthdays. I do have some photos of it. But I don't remember those things. I thought, personally, I did resent not receiving gifts, because I mean, what kid doesn't want to get gifts? Well, what kid doesn't want to, get toys? For me, it wasn't really so much about, celebrating me as a kid and celebrating that I'm alive. But yeah, I would say that I did miss not having those gifts. And the other thing that, that I recall is just being resentful and, almost embarrassed, because my friends would then ask me when I went back to school, after Christmas break, what'd you get for Christmas? And I lied. I would just mention, the newest sweater that I got, whether it was, 2 weeks ago or 2 months ago. Like, yeah. Oh, I got this sweater, and sometimes if I was, if I did get something new a few months before, I may not even wear it until after Christmas, so that I can say, oh yeah, I got this. But surely, the kids in school must have known something was up, because I would always get pulled out of class,
Which was about to be my next question, about how, whether you managed to avoid alienation in school because you were obviously very different in the way that you celebrated things, as opposed to your peer group who were putting on, like the Christmas nativity, or, and I know that a lot of communities in the parts of the world that we grew up in are very multi-faith based now. So when my children reach the age where they go to school, there may be a number of different religions that are practiced in the peer groups. But learning about different periods of fasting for different religious groups will probably be quite a typical thing for my children to grow up around. But I still feel like it would be strange for somebody in their class to actually be pulled out, and how do you, or do you even think to try and do it discreetly, or do you just go in and say, Minerva, you're not taking part in this, so can you come and do something else in and away from everybody else?
It was more challenging in elementary and middle school, because so much in those schools are about, these pageants and these little parties, and the parents sending their kids. I remember, if it was your birthday, the parents would send their child to school with 30 cupcakes for their entire class. So that was a little bit more difficult to navigate. I always made friends with the quirky people. And, but when I was in middle school, it was just me and the Jehovah's Witness kid, we hung out. And we understood, at least, even though we had differences in our religion and we had different days that we would go, to church, we understood what it was like to get pulled out of stuff. So I always made friends with the Jehovah's Witness kids. In high school, it was a little bit easier because you don't have the same amount of, pageants and, kids showing up with, cupcakes. So in high school, I don't really recall getting pulled out of a lot of things. And, if there was a Christmas event or something for the entire school, frankly, I never told my parents that, oh yeah, this is coming up. So they didn't really have the opportunity to pull me out of those high school events from what I can remember.
The Jehovah's Witness aspect is interesting, because I was going to mention when you said there, about birthdays and Christmases, I feel it's very much the same for Jehovah's Witnesses. So it's insightful that you were able to create that bond with somebody who was aligned with a faith-based group that you probably would have been steered away from had your parents known that you were interacting with somebody from that particular church. But also, they are encouraged to be in the world but not a part of it. So did you have the experience that Jehovah's Witnesses would have, where everybody stands up to do the Pledge of Allegiance and they remain sitting down because they just don't take part?
That's a little interesting. Well, first of all, it was kind of easy to be friends with Jehovah's Witnesses because it was just me and that other kid hanging out in the hall, or me and that other kid in the office. So you kind of knew, I'm like, well, you don't go to my church because I know you. So why are you here? So that part was easy. As far as, making friends, but, when it came to the Pledge of Allegiance, I don't recall my parents telling me that I couldn't be a part of that. I don't recall the cult telling us that we couldn't do that. I don't know why. I don't know if that was just, something that just wasn't thought of. If the ministers or Armstrong didn't realize that this was occurring in school, or if they just thought, we're putting enough on these kids. Let that one go.
Or whether Armstrong thought that maybe keeping church and state separated is not the way forward. Maybe he had an idea around, politics and the church working together, whereas the stance of the Jehovah's Witnesses is obviously very strong around their beliefs on voting and keeping church and state separate. But
there are some similarities though with Worldwide Church of God and Jehovah's Witnesses in that in that area, and that is that because we were in the world but we weren't supposed to be part of it, and Satan's running the world, he's running the political systems, the governments. We were not allowed to vote, be separate from the world. We were not allowed to serve on a jury. Judge not lest you be judged. We were not to voluntarily participate in the military, so we couldn't join the military. And so one of the things that the cult strongly encouraged the men, I say men, 18-year-old boys, was that at least here in the United States, a male of 18 years of age must register for the draft. And so that's the law. And so the cult said, don't break the law, go register. But they strongly encourage those individuals to enter a statement of conscientious objector in the event that the U.S. was to enter war, which, we did in the year, after 9/11. However, I was not a part of the cult at that time, and I don't know what their stance was at that time.
Which we alluded to, or which we spoke about in a previous episode recently around the film Hacksaw Ridge with the Seventh-day Adventist conscientious objector Desmond Doss, who was a pacifist and wouldn't bear arms. And there's this very moving film where he saves a lot of people by pulling them off of the battlefield discreetly in enemy territory, and saves like a whole bunch of lives. And it's based on true events, and it's a extremely moving film. And then we had a very lengthy discussion around whether you would do that or not, whether you were Seventh-day Adventist or atheist or however you aligned with your faith. Would you still try and save those people whether you were religiously inclined, or was it because of his conscientious objector status that he didn't bear arms and was in a position to save all of those lives? So we had a nice kind of moral discussion around how we thought that would play out, whether he was religious or not. But again, comes back to more links to the Seventh-day Adventists and
the cult actually did have a stance on that. They predicted that at some point the United States may enter a war. But if they did. And those who registered for the draft, put in conscientious objector. The hope would be that if they were to be called up for the draft and forced, to join the military, which did not occur after 9/11, it was all, voluntary. But if they were forced, to join the military, the hopes were that because that statement of conscientious objector was entered, that the cult member would then play a back role in the war. So maybe they would be working, in an office, or as you mentioned, cleaning up, a battlefield or helping the wounded. But the idea was that, we were not to take up arms and shoot at other people.
And another interesting link to the Jehovah's Witnesses that I've kind of scribbled down here in my notebook is when you mentioned that the doomsday predictions stopped having actual dates attached to them. It happened with the Jehovah's Witnesses as well, who have this inside joke. And they say we're now in the end times of the end times because we've been in the end times for so long. That they just say, oh, we're in the end times of the end times. And the first person that told me that, I thought it was so witty and kind of made me like, I'm glad that you can all find humor in some of the really difficult situations that they're placed in. When I say, have you got a prediction for the end of the world? Oh no, we're in the end times of the end times. And there's the r/XJW subreddit, which is so wholesome because it is full of pictures of people who are getting their first tattoos and celebrating their first birthdays and putting up their first Christmas trees, and going to watch a run through of Harry Potter. They're going to have a Harry Potter marathon, and they are they're going out to buy vinyl records from a music shop and just things that they're experiencing for the first time. Some people in their 50s, 60s and 70s, which is heartbreaking in some ways, but also so heartwarming in other ways as well, that there's a place where people can come together to celebrate those first experiences of things.
That's, that's really wonderful. It kind of reminds me of a couple of things. Our cult also was not okay with, certain things like Dungeons and Dragons. It was very anti Dungeons and Dragons. And for the longest time, I thought things like Dungeons and Dragons and, Ouija boards, both of which I'm not really interested in anyway. I'm not a big, board game person. But both of those things were labeled as being satanic, and that if you play them, you're going to have demons attached to you and they're going to go with you in life. It's really kind of odd. And I know at some point we'll probably talk about, my, what I've done, after leaving, but for the longest time, I didn't have a Christmas tree. Because there's scriptures in the Jewish Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, that says specifically, don't cut a tree down and decorate it like the pagans do. I still celebrated Christmas. Like I went to parties and, I exchanged gifts with people, but the idea of just like having a tree in my house just seems so strange. I didn't know how to do it. And I have to say that it wasn't until recent years when I got married that I learned, what the things were called. Like I wasn't quite sure what the mistletoe was versus like the tinsel. And I didn't know how do you get those balls on there? They don't come with like a little hook. Like what is that called? And how do I get that? Like there are all these, very holiday specific themes that I didn't know. we were going to celebrate, the holidays with someone, and they were going to sing Christmas carols. And I had to pull my husband aside, and I said, "You got to get me educated on these Christmas carols. I can't sing along." He's like, "But everybody knows these." I'm like, "No, you don't understand." He's like, "How are you not exposed to this?" And I'm like, "I wasn't. I'm just, I would hear something in the store or whatever, but I can't, sing along to all of these. You need to get me up to date on this so that I can, at least present some kind of, front that I know
so
what I'm
funny
doing."
when people say, "How do you not know about this? And how do you not know about that? And how have you never watched Lord of the Rings? Surely you know the plot of Lord of the Rings."
That is the end of part 1 of this week's episode. If you'd like to get in touch, you can find me at cultvaultpodcast@gmail.com or follow me on Twitter and Instagram at cultvaultpod. I'm your speaker, Casey, and this has been The Cult Vault.